The sun hung heavy over the frontier town, pressing its weight into the dust as if trying to crush every living thing beneath it. The air shimmered with heat, wavering above the roofs, and the ground carried the sound of boots, hooves, and wagon wheels like a great tired drum. The square was alive with the careless bustle of men who had worked too long and drunk too much, voices sharp as broken glass, laughter jagged. And there, in the center, a horse was tethered to a post, ribs showing through a dull coat, eyes weary with a kind of knowing that came from being passed from one hand to another until no hand cared at all. The auctioneer's voice rang out, cracked from whiskey and use, calling for bids no one wished to give. The horse tossed its head, a half-hearted attempt at defiance, but the crowd answered with laughter. To them, the animal was just another burden in a land already full of them. Among the faces stood a girl, or rather, what was left of one. She was 23, though hardship had carved deeper years into her face. Her dress was little more than rags stitched together, stained with earth and shadowed with bruises half hidden by sleeves that hung too loose on her arms. Dust clung to her hair, once a shade of autumn wheat but now dulled, as if even color had abandoned her. Her eyes, though, her eyes had not given up. They carried something fierce, a flame dampened but not dead. She stood apart, not welcomed by the women who turned their shoulders, nor the men whose stares carried hunger or disdain. She had no home. That much the town knew, and they used it like a whip. The settlers who had beaten her before watched from the back of the crowd, their smirks curling like snakes in the dust. They whispered of her shame, of her worthlessness, and their words stung her ears like nettles. The auctioneer barked out again, lowering the price. No hands rose. Even pity was too costly for a horse that had been worked near to death. The moment stretched, uncomfortable, and silence threatened to drown the square. It was then her voice broke it, not loud, not desperate, but steady, trembling like the first drop of rain after drought. "Don't buy the horse." Heads turned. The crowd parted just enough for their eyes to settle on her, the strange girl with nothing to her name. She swallowed, forced breath into her lungs, and spoke again. "I've no home, take me instead. I'll be yours forever." Laughter cracked through the silence, cruel and raucous. Men nudged one another, mocking. Women muttered about shame, about indecency. Someone spat into the dirt at her feet. But she did not lower her gaze. Her words, raw and bare, floated above their jeers like smoke refusing to be smothered. From the edge of the crowd, a figure shifted. A man, taller than most, his shoulders broad beneath a dust-worn coat, his hands callous from work that wealth had not excused him from. He was 32, strong with the quiet kind of strength that did not need to prove itself. His face was sun-browned, his jaw rough with stubble, his eyes steady, though their steadiness made others restless. He had come to town only for supplies, for nails and salt and feed, but her words stopped him as surely as a bullet to the chest. He studied her. Not the dirt on her skin or the rags of her dress, not the whispers clinging to her like flies, but the way she stood, bruised yet unbowed. The way her eyes dared to hope even while the crowd tried to bury her. There was no performance in her plea, no artifice. Only truth, sharp as hunger, bare as bone. The settlers who had hurt her laughed louder, their voices dripping poison. They shouted that she was ruined, that no man with sense would touch her, that she was worth less than the horse she mocked. Their cruelty tried to crowd the air, to make her words vanish. But still the rancher watched. The auctioneer cleared his throat, uneasy, trying to steer attention back to the animal. A weak bid rose and fell. Dust swirled, wind carrying the scent of sweat, of leather, of something about to break. And in that fragile moment, the rancher moved. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the dirt with a measured calm that silenced some and unsettled more. He placed the coin in the auctioneer's hand, not for the horse, but to end the noise. Then he shrugged off his coat, heavy and worn, and crossed the short space to where she stood. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her frame, smelled of smoke and saddle oil, and carried a warmth that made her knees tremble. The crowd muttered restless, uncertain whether to laugh or fear. The settlers hissed between their teeth, but no man dared step closer. She pulled the coat tight, tears pricking her eyes, not from weakness, but from the unbearable strangeness of being sheltered. For the first time in years, someone had seen her without scorn. He did not speak, nor did she. The silence between them held more weight than the crowd's noise. His eyes lingered not with possession, but with recognition, as if he saw not just the woman before him, but the life she might still become. The dust lifted in a sudden wind, sweeping across the square, carrying with it the laughter, the whispers, the cruelty. In its wake, only the two of them seemed to remain, bound not by bargain but by a moment that felt older than the town itself. And as the wind settled, the settlers' mocking voices rose once more, sharper now, edged with the promise of trouble. Their faces darkened like a storm gathering on the horizon, and though the rancher's hand never reached his gun, the crowd could see the steel in his stillness. Something had shifted, something that would not be easily undone. The road out of town was long, the wagon creaking beneath its load, and she sat on the wooden bench beside him with her hands folded tight in her lap. Neither spoke. The field stretched wide, golden and empty, the horizon blurring into sky. Dust lifted behind them like a ghost that refused to let go, and with every mile, the sound of the jeering crowd grew fainter, though it lingered in her memory like a bruise that would not fade. His silence was not cruel. It was steady, like the low hum of earth itself. Now and then he glanced at her, not to measure or judge, but to be sure she had not vanished beside him. She sat wrapped in his coat, the sleeves falling past her wrists, the weight of it pressing against her bones as if reminding her she was still here, still held by something more than air. The ranch appeared at last, spread across the valley with its fences stretching like lines of scripture carved into the land. Cattle dotted the fields, their slow movement a hymn to patience. The house was not grand but strong, weathered boards standing against wind and storm. To her eyes it looked like a fortress, though the door hung open as if welcoming the world. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke and bread long cooled. He showed her the hearth, the table, the spare room where a bed waited with quilts folded neat at the foot. She touched the quilt with cautious fingers, as though it might dissolve if she held it too firmly. He left her there without instruction, as if to grant her the space to decide whether she would stay or flee. Days unfolded like slow rivers. She swept the porch, her bare feet brushing against the sun-warmed wood. She fed chickens that scattered with nervous wings. She washed clothes in the creek, hands reddened by cold water, and hung them on the line where the wind gave them the grace of dance. She burned bread once, smoke filling the room, and braced for anger. But he sat at the table, ate every bite, and only asked if she wanted him to chop more wood. He did not press her with questions. Still, she found herself speaking in fragments. She told him of the settler's cruelty, of the years when she was passed from one shelter to another like a stray pup no one wanted to claim. She spoke of nights spent under porches, mornings where hunger gnawed so sharp it felt like teeth inside her belly. Her words spilled out as though they had waited years for a quiet place to fall. He never interrupted. He listened with the patience of soil waiting for rain. At dusk they sat by the fire. He mended tools, his hands steady, while she stitched torn seams with thread borrowed from a neighbor. She noticed the small ways he shifted space for her, the chair placed closer to the fire, the lantern set on her side of the table so her work might be easier. He rarely smiled, but she began to learn the language of his silence, the way his shoulders eased when she entered a room, the way his gaze softened when she spoke. But the world outside their quiet circle did not rest. In town, tongues wagged sharper each day. They called her a beggar who had tricked him, a stain on his wealth. Women clutched their shawls tighter when she passed, and men muttered about shame. She felt the sting like nettles beneath her skin. One afternoon, she lingered at the edge of the barn with a small bundle in her hand, a worn shawl, a crust of bread, nothing more. He found her there, eyes wide as if caught in sin. She stammered that she should not stay, that she was only bringing him scorn. His shadow fell long across the doorway, his voice quiet but firm. Stay. If you leave, you'll be alone again. If you stay, maybe we'll both find something we've lost. Her breath broke. She dropped the bundle and let it scatter across the floor like pieces of a past she no longer wished to carry. In his eyes there was no claim, only invitation. It was then she began to believe that perhaps home was not a place, but the way one's soul made room for another. Weeks passed. She planted small seeds behind the house, though she did not know if they would grow. He repaired the roof, glancing down sometimes to see her bent over the soil, hair falling loose across her face. At night, when storms rattled the shutters, she no longer curled alone in her bed. She sat near the fire while he played with the hound's ears, the silence between them no longer empty but full of unspoken promise. Yet even peace carried shadows. One evening, she returned from the creek with a basket of clothes only to find hoof prints stamped deep in the mud near the fence line. Too many, too fresh. Her chest tightened. She knew whose boots would have left them, whose laughter would soon echo again across the land. She looked toward the horizon where dark clouds gathered, not of weather but of men who refused to let her rest. The wind carried the faint echo of voices, cruel and familiar, and the weight of his coat on her shoulders suddenly felt less like comfort and more like armor. Inside, the lantern flickered, and he lifted his head at the sound of her steps. She wanted to speak, to warn, but the words tangled in her throat. He saw the fear in her eyes and set his tools aside, rising with the stillness of a man who had been waiting for this storm all along. The night came heavy with the weight of a storm, clouds stacking above the valley like darkened mountains. The air smelled of iron and rain, sharp and electric. She stood on the porch, the hem of her dress tugged by restless wind, staring toward the horizon where shadows moved with purpose. Torches flickered in the distance, carried by men she knew too well, faces twisted by old cruelty, voices sharpened by the thrill of unfinished torment. The rancher stepped beside her, shoulders squared against the rising gale. He said nothing at first, but his presence was a wall, a shield she had never known. When she whispered that they had come for her, his eyes did not falter. He only placed his hand on the post as though grounding himself to the very land he had sworn to keep. Hooves struck the earth like war drums as the settlers rode closer, their jeers cutting through the wind. They reined up before the fence, whiskey bottles glinting in their hands, laughter rolling bitter and loud. One shouted that she was theirs to cast out, another spat that no rich man should waste his land on a beggar. Their words lashed the air, crueler than the storm itself. The rancher stepped down into the yard, rain beginning to fall in cold needles against his hat. He faced them with the calm of stone cliffs meeting waves. His rifle hung across his back, untouched, though his silence held more power than steel. In a voice low but unshakable, he told them she was not theirs, not a thing to claim or discard, but a woman who would remain under his roof, his protection, his respect. The settlers sneered, circling their horses, spitting their venom. One raised a torch as though daring to set fire to the barn, another gripped the handle of a knife. But neighbors had gathered by then, men who worked his fields, women who baked bread for his table, children who played in the shadow of his fences. They came from the edges of the land, silent at first, then stepping forward to stand behind him. The settlers saw they were outnumbered, their bluster thinning into mutters. The torch lowered, the knife slipped back into its sheath, and one by one they retreated, their curses trailing into the storm. When the yard emptied, the rain poured harder, drumming against the earth with fury. She stood trembling, her breath shallow, as though she had been holding it for years. He returned to her, soaked through, water streaming down his face, and in the lantern's glow she saw not just strength but something deeper, resolve bound with tenderness. Inside, the fire crackled, fighting against the storm's howl. She sat by the hearth, fingers twisting the edge of his coat, words caught in her throat. At last she broke, tears spilling, voice breaking with a confession she had carried too long, that she feared she could never repay what he had done, that she was too broken to offer him anything whole. He knelt beside her, the firelight casting shadows across his jaw. His hand rose, hesitated, then touched her cheek as though she were something fragile yet unshatterable. "You already have," he said softly. "You gave me a reason to come home each day." The storm raged on, rattling shutters, shaking walls, yet within those walls something else was born. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heart, steady, certain, a sound more grounding than thunder. His arms wrapped around her not as a claim but as a vow, and for the first time she let herself believe she was safe. Days later, the storm passed, leaving the land washed clean. The fields glistened, the air sweet with the scent of wet earth. She knelt in the garden, coaxing sprouts from the soil, her laughter rising light as larks. It startled her at first, the sound of her own joy, but he heard it from the porch and removed his hat, watching as though he were witnessing something sacred. Life settled into rhythms new and tender. She woke to the warmth of sunlight filtering through curtains she had sewn herself. She worked the land not as a servant but as a partner, and each evening he returned from the pastures with dust on his boots and quiet in his eyes that told her she was the peace waiting for him. They spoke more now, not in grand declarations but in the simple music of shared days. What seed to plant, what fence to mend, which calf needed tending. Yet beneath the peace, shadows lingered. The settlers had retreated, but their anger had not vanished. Whispers drifted on the wind, warnings passed between neighbors that vengeance does not die so easily. She carried that fear like a stone in her pocket, heavy but hidden, even as she learned the weight of happiness. One evening, when the sun fell molten behind the hills, painting the world in fire, she found him leaning against the porch rail, eyes fixed on the horizon. His face was calm, yet she saw in the set of his jaw the truth he had not spoken, that danger still lived beyond their fences, that storms come not once but many times. She joined him, slipping her hand into his, and for a long moment they stood in silence. The wind carried the scent of rain yet to fall, the promise of trials yet to come. Still, her heart no longer cowered. It beat steady with his, not because the world had grown kinder, but because they had chosen to face it together. And as the first star pierced the twilight, she whispered what she had never dared before, that if the settlers returned, if the storm rose again, she would not beg to be taken in. She would stand beside him, not as a stray seeking shelter, but as a woman who had found her place. His hand tightened around hers, a silent oath. And in that hush between day and night she understood, the storm had not ended, it had only changed.